He's the former federal prosecutor now working the defense side of the table. You can hear him in London. You could hear him this morning in London talking about this case. He is on all these major news outlets internationally. I'm so proud that he could jump in with us for a quick second and set us straight on what's going on with this Trump indictment. How about it for David Katz, everybody?
Good morning, guys.
Good morning, sir. Thank you again. Tell us what's going on. This is like at the indictment buffet. I feel like Fani Willis pretty much loaded up her tray.
Well, I'm not going to tell your listener of a trial or an arrest of Trump, so sorry about that. This was, however, almost a 100-page indictment. It's very specific. It lays out over 100 overt acts. It says that Trump was the head of a racketeering conspiracy, which is something we hear about more in mafia cases from 30, 40 years ago. However, it should be noted it's used a lot in civil litigation, and a lot of civil plaintiffs call defendants racketeers, and no one likes to be called a racketeer, especially if you're a Fortune 500 company. And there's been talk about curtailing it, and obviously there's a value in calling Trump and his minions racketeers and a racketeering enterprise. For the Trump supporters, and maybe for sort of a swing part of the country, this may be seen as a little bit of overcharging for various reasons, which we can get into. But it's extremely significant because in the case in New York, he's the sole defendant. In the Mar-a-Lago case, he's charged, but along with two, a valet and a handyman. And in Washington, D.C., in federal court, he's the only one charged, although there are 5 or 6 named co-conspirators, but not charged. I shouldn't say named. We figured out who they were. And we thought that Meadows not being one of them, that maybe Meadows, the former White House chief of staff during this critical period, during December 2020 and January 2021, might be one of the cooperators. Now people are saying, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense. Why would he be charged so prominently in this indictment if he were cooperating with with Jack Smith, the special counsel in the Washington, D.C. case? The cases obviously have a great deal of overlap. In fact, as to Trump, you could say that this is sort of a subset in more detail of what he did in the 3 conspiracies in Washington, D.C. He was trying to not be, not to leave office, even though he'd lost. He had various conspiracies to falsely certify, falsely count the vote, mischaracterize things. And he did it probably worse than anywhere else in Georgia, hoping that he could get the domino effect to start. He hoped if he could turn the Republican state of Georgia, where he had a Republican governor, Republican secretary of state, he thought if he could get those people to be pliable, if he could push them around and threaten them into changing the vote there, that he would go on to other states and basically tie up. What he was trying to do? He was trying to not have the vote certified by Pence on January 6th, get that delay. The military wouldn't have known what to do. Everybody would have frozen. There would have been either competing inaugurations or no inaugurations, and Trump would have just stayed on in power, even though he was the loser.
Yeah, exactly right. This same dance that he was doing in Georgia, he was prepared to do elsewhere, and had already sort of laid the groundwork for that. And that gets me to this RICO thing. When you talk about conspiracy, the dragnet legally that she has laid out is designed to show the network of people involved. Is that right, David? So to what extent they have to be a part of these things? Do they what determines their guilt or innocence? In other words, if they're hip deep in it, is that worse than if they were only sort of a small part of it?
Well, as a federal criminal defense attorney, Mark, I have so many criticisms of how she proceeded, except I do think that Trump is the exception, and his minions, his cronies, who deserve this treatment. But generally speaking, this is her 11th RICO case. Some of them were against teachers who supposedly certified people had passed on to the next grade level and they hadn't. I mean, it's so ripe for abuse. So I'm not defending Trump on this. I'm saying I think Trump is the exceptional person who probably deserved this, given the depth of what he did and the corruptness of it. But some of the problems with it are you only have to prove what are called 2 predicate acts. So you can lay out 150 overt acts that the prosecutor can aim at, And yet you, as an individual defendant, only have to be convicted of 2 predicate acts. And they can be sort of normal mail fraud, wire fraud, having somebody file a certificate. So in that sense, the proof is extremely easy. The other thing that I don't like about the cases is that there's a mandatory minimum. You know, for progressive prosecutors who don't like mandatory minimums and who complain about all these poor folks who are sitting in jail with a mandatory minimum that they had to receive 5, 10 years in prison. Well, there's a mandatory minimum. And she bragged at the press conference last night that you can't get probation on any of them. So it's jail time, she said. And of course, the threat when you do that, and we've criticized this in other contexts, is that a lot of people who are not guilty are going to think, you know, and on the one hand, I could go home to my wife and kids and my life. On the other hand, I could be serving 5 years in prison if I assert my constitutional rights. If I say I'm not guilty, which I have a right to say, if I go to trial, if the dice don't come up my way, 5 years in prison, I don't care what's behind door B. I don't really care whether I'm guilty. I'm innocent. If I have a defense, what's behind door B? And it's 5 years in prison. And so what she hopes here, of course, is that she's going to get some of those 19 to flip. When she says that she's going to try them all within 6 months, all 19 of them. I had a judge say one time when I said, I want a severance. He said, you know what? Your co-defendants will sever this case for you, meaning that so many will plead guilty, you won't end up with 19. You'll end up with at most 5 or 6. And just one parenthetical, I tried a case down in the San Diego federal court. My client was acquitted in the case. I mentioned this case to you sometimes, where we had 6 defendants on trial. And even 6 was very unwieldy, where there were a lot of different promotions and different parts of the conspiracy. It was 4.5 months in trial. Think about some of those 19 people. They really cannot afford a lawyer to spend months and months in trial. Again, Trump can, Giuliani can, but just looking at the overall scope of it. So yes, she has made it incredibly difficult on all of those defendants, including some that in my judgment deserve to have it made awfully difficult on them. But for all 19, they have to go hire a lawyer. They have to have this enormous stress. Whether they have to be there in the courtroom is another issue. I don't think Trump needs to be there in the courtroom. I'd love to talk about that, how he accommodates his schedule and now 4 different cases going to trial.
Okay, I want to get to that in a second, and then I want to quickly to let our audience know, I will address with David the 2 ways that I've read that Trump actually could escape justice in Georgia completely. But I'll get to that. I'll get to the 2. But I also want to indicate we have a poll up. And the poll will be something that you're interested in, David Katz, because you're so good on this stuff. The poll is, will Donald Trump ever go to prison? Period. I think that's what, isn't that what it says, Tony? So I believe that's what the wording on it. And so in our poll, apparently, and I'm getting this only because of the feedback I'm getting. Tony, can you tell us where people are pretty much feeling as though Trump will not go to prison? Isn't that correct?
Yeah, it's 64 to 8. Just wrote, will Trump do any prison time?
Will Trump do any prison time for anything? Okay, it can be for anything. It could be in Georgia, anywhere. Will Trump do any prison time?
And
you've always maintained, no. David. So it's 60-40 no, and I think people have responded to some of the comments you've made along the way. The pre-indictment, I might add, in Georgia, that he wouldn't do any prison time. So this speaks to the schedule and how he's handled and the election and all the rest. So now to the schedule. So please vote. You can vote in the chat on that. And what happens, David? How does the legal docket get handled with this Georgia information now entering things in the last day?
Well, I hope this isn't getting a far afield, but I think it's important to understand this. You know, it all starts with this case in New York City. That one came first. And that one, it can be, I think, credibly argued, should have come about 1.5 years or 2 years earlier. Remember, there were 2 special prosecutors on that case. One was a very competent lawyer from a big law firm who basically made that his project to put this case together against Trump. It was a lot more than hiding with Michael Cohen or generating documents with Michael Cohen or with people from the Trump organization that made it look like they hadn't paid hush money to this porn star when they had. But there was so much more to that case. It was Trump's taxes. It was Trump's other misconduct. It was all kinds of other illegality. They didn't go on that case. Those 2 prosecutors both resigned. One of them wrote a book. And then it ended up being sort of one of those things, well, my goodness, after all those years, this is what we ended up with. That case is going to go to trial, supposedly, I think, around March of 2024. Everybody keep your eye on
is the order that they're brought in, the indictments, does that have any effect on the order that they'll actually? No, okay.
the trial judge can change everything. They can change the trial date. They couldn't drastically move it up. The defendant would say, I'm not prepared, but they could certainly push it back. Then the second one was the one down in the Southern District of Florida, which, it was not one that anybody sat on. It was one that he committed that crime, as he left the White House and after he left the White House and after they served the subpoena. And of course, the devastating fact for him there is that after he had his attorney certified that there were no top secret documents there, they came in on a search warrant approved by a federal magistrate judge, and they found just what he and his lawyers said were not there anymore. So that's a devastating piece of evidence. But I've said already, I think that it was an unforced error to bring that case down in the Southern District of Florida with a 1 in 3 chance of getting that very Trump-friendly judge. And so I don't see with the national security issues that there's any way that that case goes to trial. And so if Trump or one of his allies gets into power in 2024, that case will be kiboshed. That case will not go anywhere. He will not go to prison in that case. I don't think he's going to go to prison in the New York City case that we just talked about, because it's kind of roll your eyes offense. Whether that's right or it's wrong, you need to have everything go the prosecutor's way, even to bump it up to a felony. He's sure not going to jail on a misdemeanor. Then you get to the Washington, D.C. case, which largely overlaps with this case. But as I said, this is an intense, this is intense in one state, whereas the others were generalized over various states. And there was a lot of the conduct that just got charged last night that happened in these other states, but this is very specific to Georgia. And so I think there's a real issue in that case. I'm not trying to, sound like Jim Allen is going to say, this is what I've been hearing on the right-wing stations. But there is a real issue. Why did Merrick Garland take over 2 years, right, to appoint a special prosecutor? And you see all of these 4 cases end up to have been delayed or handled, not so much the Mar-a-Lago case, but certainly these other 3 cases. There is an argument that Trump is going to make over and over again that this was all scheduled by Democrats so that it would go during the year and 3 months that he was running for president against Biden. This was all held up. Why did the special counsel not get appointed? And then they got a real go-go special prosecutor. So from a Machiavellian point of view, you think, okay, I get it. He sits on it for over 2 years with evidence that's basically known from January 2021. He sits on it for all that time. He appoints a real go-getter special counsel. Easy to guess that that guy will get his act together much faster, charge this case in 9 months, and lo and behold, you'll have a Democratic appointed judge in very Democratic Washington, D.C., lecture the Trump side. I'm seeing you as a criminal defendant. I'm not seeing you as a presidential candidate. The shoe on the other foot, Idaho, Texas, you name it, Alabama, got together, charged Joe Biden with a bunch of stuff, and he was being lectured by judges. I don't see you, Mr. President, as a presidential candidate in 2024. I see you as a criminal defendant, and I'm going to make this order and that order, and don't abuse the discovery, and do this and do that. I don't see it that way. I think it's so different because of the things that Trump did, and that he deserves the prosecutions, each one of them that he's gotten, but that's going to be his narrative.
Wow, that's terrific. And, I must say, in the comments after we went off the air yesterday, and I look at the comments because most people watch the show in delay, I was taken to task because I felt that we were talking about the fact that somebody said, what about the cluster? This is sort of a cluster of cases that was dropped on Trump. Doesn't that feel like it was a political act? And I said, well, first of all, I don't feel as though they didn't use the word cluster. I used the word cluster. They said the timing, it all happened at the same time. I said, well, it's a cluster, but it's not all dropping at the same time. But you actually make a pretty, compelling argument for the notion that, well, it was clearly slow walked. I mean, the timing on this case. I thought it was because they wanted it to go away. But you suggest, without actually making the argument, you suggest that the argument can be made effectively, that it was political. Now I want to ask you about this federal law called the removal statute. If a state indicts a federal official, that federal official can request the transfer of this case to a federal court. So you go away from the whole Georgia state thing. There's no way he can pardon himself. If you actually could change the venue to a federal court, he tried this in the Manhattan case, I think. Can you speak to that?
Well, I think that this case has a nucleus of action that's in the state. It's hard for people to remember sometimes that while we have federal elections, they're conducted by the state. So including the presidential election. So this was very much state business to run this election. If the state didn't run the election fairly, the answer was not for the federal government to intercede. It was for people on the aggrieved party side to go into the state courts and ask the state court for relief. They tried that, but they lost in every state court. They also lost in federal court. The Trump side did. So I think that a federal judge will not allow this case to be removed. I think it will be kept in the state court. But of course, the leapfrog is that first you remove it to the federal court, then it becomes a federal conviction, then it's something that can be pardoned later on. I want to say something that is very short and very scary. I think that Trump has said to his other co-defendants, by the way he communicates, Truth Social, his people put out the word, kind of a let's hang together or we will surely hang separately. And I think that they have a strong motivation. I know they want to get out of the 5-year mandatory minimum sentence. Would that really be imposed? Would some judge be willing to say in state court that for some lower down person to get 5 years as a mandatory minimum, with the judge saying, this person is sick, this person was minimally involved, this person has all the reasons in the world for mitigation and for a lower sentence, and it's unconstitutional, it's cruel and unusual punishment to impose 5 years on that person. They have that hope, but don't bet so much on your constitutional argument. I think the argument that they're getting from Trump is that, look, if I get back into office, and I don't mean to scare people, but I think we know Trump and we know the kind of way that he thinks and the incredibly vindictive way he is. He said, look, if I get back into office, I'll not only get rid of the 2 federal cases, but I will make war on Georgia and all the people who tried to get me in state court down there. And it's not a happy prospect to have war made on you by the president of the United States if you're a state DA somewhere. And I know she's got all the protection, all the sheriffs. She's got the right not to be indicted wrongly for something. But, I don't know, he puts one of the people, you can imagine one of the people that Trump might put in as attorney general, and before you know it, he indicts a bunch of people, right?
Sure. You're right about it being both scary and plausible, given who he is.
The other 18 people in this case might say, you know what? Let's just see how I'm not going to start my 5 years. I'm not going to start my 5 years before January 2025. Let's see how it all plays. So I don't think we're going to have a massive number of flips in that case. I think as long as Trump has this huge power and has the prospect of being nominated and maybe being the next president, I think a lot of people will hold their tongues. And the case, there's no way it gets to trial in 6 months. And one last thing, they may take 1 or 2 people who are very, who are not very guilty. And I don't know exactly the case on Jeffrey Clark. He might be a candidate. One of the people you don't really know about who did.
He was the guy that Trump wanted to make attorney general. Isn't that right?
Right. And they'll say, I want to go to trial. Jeffrey Clark will say, look, I know this case is going to take a year to go to trial, and I don't want to wait a year. I want to clear my reputation. I have a right to a speedy trial. I want my case severed, and take one of the weakest people to trial first and let the whole nation watch that, maybe televised, to watch the weakest case go to trial first. Don't count that out as a strategy by the defense team.
Oh, that's really interesting. Really interesting. Well, I'm out of time. I got Jim Avila waiting, but I just wonder if you can just comment. The Georgia legislature passed a law. I think it goes into effect in 8 weeks that allows them to replace, I believe, any district attorney in the state. So when we come back, you can comment on it now, but I'd certainly like to comment on Thursday whether you think that's a possibility that Kemp, who is, I think he's a GOP loyalist in the state of Georgia, might he not just replace the district attorney and we're done?
If she plays her cards right, I don't think that will happen. I think it's too controversial, and it's very easy for someone like Governor Kemp, who's resisted these blandishments and threats from Trump before, to say, look, this is due process. Everyone's presumed innocent. Everyone has a right to a trial. Let's have the case go to trial with this district attorney. I'm not going to remove her. That would seem to be a political earthquake that Kemp doesn't really need, and the moderates in the Georgia legislature, they don't really need that one. And the trial's not going to trial against Trump anytime soon. It's just not with 19 defendants, especially if a lot of them don't flip.
He is David Katz. He'll join us normally on Thursday. So appreciate him being here today. I'll tell you what, I'll call the comments and also emails, and we'll have questions for you on Thursday. Thanks, David Katz. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you, Mark.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.